Nobody in the Galactic Compact remembered the exact date anymore. That was the strange part. You'd think something like that, the moment that changed the course of 12 civilizations, you'd think someone would have written it down carefully, put it in an archive, carved it into the side of a monument somewhere. But no. The Valorians didn't record it. They were too ashamed. The Drokai didn't speak of it at all. They considered shame a communicable disease. The Sephine collective erased their logs from that period entirely, not out of malice, just habit. They deleted things that made them look small. And the humans. The humans didn't write it down because, at the time, there was only one of them. One human, on a station that wasn't his. In a corner of the galaxy that had never heard of Earth and didn't care to. And he was too busy trying not to die to worry about posterity. His name was Corporal Rael Morrow. And what he did, or more accurately, what was done to him, and then what humanity did about it, became the single most important moment in the last 400 years of galactic history. I know this because I was there. Not at the beginning, but close enough. Let me tell you what actually happened. Set up. The station was called Orvanthis Deep. If you've never heard of it, that's fine. Most people haven't, even now. It sits at the outer rim of what the Compact used to call the unregistered drift, a long, cold corridor of space between the Drokai sovereignty and what was then called the Sephine buffer zone. Back then, nobody claimed it officially. It was the kind of place that existed on maps only as a warning. Here be nothing worth having. But nothing worth having often attracts exactly the kind of people who profit from that label. Orvanthis Deep was a trading post, legally speaking, a way station where ships stopped to refuel, restock, repair, and occasionally disappear without explanation. It was operated by a consortium of Valorian merchants, three-limbed, copper-scaled, polite to your face and dishonest behind your back, who had a gift for maintaining plausible neutrality in every conflict they ever quietly profited from. I arrived there aboard a Sephine courier vessel called the Varanthal, 11 days out from the border checkpoint at Kala Station. I was working as a cargo interpreter at the time, not a glamorous profession. Sephine trade manifests were written in a dialect so layered with subtext and implied context that most standard translation systems gave up halfway through. I had spent 6 years learning to read them. It paid adequately. It kept me moving through the universe, which was all I'd ever wanted. Orvanthis Deep looked, from the outside, like a compressed cloud of gray metal slowly being strangled by its own docking arms. It had been expanded 11 times since original construction without any coordinated architectural plan, so the result was a station that looked like several different stations had tried to merge, and none of them had wanted to go first. Tubes connected to platforms that connected to spheres that connected to tubes going somewhere else entirely. There were sectors where the artificial gravity shifted without warning. There were corridors that looped back on themselves in ways that made no mathematical sense. There were cafeterias that existed in 3 different registry systems under 3 different names, which was useful if you needed to disappear for a meal. I liked it honestly. Places with that much accumulated history are interesting. Every corridor has a story. Every sealed door is a mystery. You just had to know where to look and how to listen. I arrived on what the station called the second watch of the outer rotation, which, if you're translating to standard time, is roughly early morning local. The docking arm smelled of recycled atmosphere and something chemical I couldn't identify. The processing bay was staffed by 2 Valorian clerks who were arguing with each other in rapid, overlapping Valorian, a language that sounds like someone repeatedly crumpling a very large piece of paper, while simultaneously processing arrivals with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes from doing something so many times you no longer need to think about it. I joined the queue. There were maybe 40 arrivals ahead of me. Cargo haulers mostly, broad-shouldered Drokai workers in their gray thermal coats, a cluster of Sephine traders who kept adjusting their environmental filters, a few species I didn't recognize. And then, near the front of the line, I noticed him. The human. You have to understand, at that point in galactic history, humans were not common travelers. Earth had been registered in the Compact databases for just under 30 years. Contact had been established, protocols had been exchanged, and humanity had been granted observer status, which in Compact terms meant we acknowledge your existence and reserve the right to ignore you. Humans traveled occasionally, usually as part of scientific delegations or, in rarer cases, military exchange programs. This one was wearing a military exchange uniform, Compact standard gray with the gold and blue shoulder flash of the Terran Cooperative Defense Force, corporal rank insignia. Young, I guessed mid-20s, though humans are hard to age. He had the build of someone who'd spent time doing physical training in earnest. Broad shoulders, straight posture, the kind of quiet stillness that military people develop when they've learned that moving unnecessarily costs energy you might need later. His name tag, visible even from 20 feet away, read, Morrow. He was standing at the front of the queue, and the Valorian clerk was talking to him, or rather at him, in a tone I recognized immediately. It was the tone of deliberate obstruction, dressed up as bureaucratic necessity. I moved closer. Not rudely, there was space along the wall, but close enough to hear. The clerk was saying, in Compact standard, that Corporal Morrow's transit documentation was insufficient. That observer status travel permits required a secondary authorization stamp that could only be obtained from the Compact Liaison Office. That the Compact Liaison Office was located in Sector 7 Gamma. That Sector 7 Gamma was currently undergoing maintenance recertification and would not be accessible for 4 days. That in the meantime, Corporal Morrow would need to return to his point of origin or apply for a temporary holding berth, which would cost 340 Compact credits per standard rotation, plus a deposit of 800 credits, refundable upon approved departure. Morrow listened to all of this very calmly. Then he said, in accented but functional Compact standard, that his documentation had been verified at Callus Station 11 days ago and cleared for transit directly to Orvanthis Deep, where he was scheduled to meet a Compact military liaison before continuing to the Drokai border observation post. The clerk said that Callus Station verification was a preliminary clearance only and did not constitute full arrival authorization. Morrow asked where this requirement was documented in the Observer Transit Code. The clerk said that it was in the supplementary addendum. Morrow asked to see the supplementary addendum. The clerk said it was not available for public review. There was a pause, just a breath's worth. Then Morrow said, very quietly, that he understood, and he would like to speak to a station administrator. The clerk said administrators were not available during processing hours. Another pause. I could see the muscle in Morrow's jaw. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. He was a young man in unfamiliar territory, being deliberately blocked by a system that had decided, for reasons that probably had nothing to do with him personally, that making him small was easier than doing the right thing. I'd seen it before. Different species, different stations, same bureaucratic contempt, but something about watching it happen to this particular human, alone, disciplined, clearly trying to do everything right, made something in me go still and sharp. I stepped forward. "Excuse me," I said in Valorian. Both the clerk and Morrow looked at me. I addressed the clerk in his own language, which had the immediate effect of changing his expression from practiced boredom to something more cautious. This officer's documentation was cleared under the Joint Observer Military Exchange Protocol, Article 7, Section 3. That protocol supersedes the Supplementary Transit Addendum under Compact Unified Travel Code Revision 42, which was ratified 8 years ago. You are aware of this." The clerk's copper scales rippled, the Valorian equivalent of a flinch. "Furthermore," I continued, "this station's operating license is contingent on non-discriminatory processing of all registered compact travelers and observer status personnel. If you would like, I am happy to file a processing complaint on this officer's behalf with the Compact Commerce Oversight Division, which I believe has an inspector currently aboard this station." I passed his office in the docking arm. He seemed alert. That last part was a bluff. I had no idea if there was an inspector aboard. But the clerk didn't know that either. His scales rippled again. He looked at Morrow's documents. He stamped them. He handed them back with a short, clipped phrase in Valorian that translated roughly as "Welcome to the station. Enjoy your stay," but carried overtones that I will not repeat. Morrow took the documents. He looked at me. "Thank you," he said, in English first instinctively. Then he caught himself and switched to Compact Standard. "Thank you, I wasn't sure what was happening there." "You were being obstructed," I said. "It happens, especially with species that are new to transit routes. Some clerks interpret observer status as tolerated inconvenience." He absorbed this. "Is it always like that?" "Sometimes worse," I said honestly. "You handled it well. Most people would have either given up or gotten angry. Neither one helps." Something shifted in his expression, a small, genuine look of relief that he was trying to contain behind professionalism. "I almost got angry," he admitted. "Didn't want to make it worse." "That's good judgment," I said. We walked through the processing bay together and into the main concourse of Orvanthis Deep. The noise hit you immediately, a broad wash of sound, dozens of languages layering over each other, the hiss of environmental systems, the percussion of cargo crates being moved somewhere below the floor plates. The light was amber-tinted, a compromise between the visual preferences of 6 different species that occupied the station regularly. Everything smelled faintly of metal and distant cooking, and something organic I'd never been able to identify. Morrow stood for a moment just taking it in. I recognized that look too, the first-time stillness of someone encountering a universe that was larger and stranger than expected, and trying to decide whether that was terrifying or wonderful. He seemed to settle on wonderful. "First posting off Earth?" I asked. "Second," he said. "First was Callus Station, but that's mostly human-operated. This is," he trailed off, looking at a cluster of Drokai workers moving through the crowd like a slow, gray tide. "Different." "Different is accurate," I said. I gave him directions to the Compact Military Liaison Office, Sector 4, Upper Ring, take the 3rd lift because the first 2 had been broken for 6 months and the station kept claiming they were under repair. He thanked me again. We parted. He went one way. I went another. I didn't think about him much after that. I had work to do. The Varanthal's manifest needed sorting, and there were 3 brokers waiting for my assessment of a disputed cargo claim. But I remembered him. The way he'd stood in that line, disciplined and alone. The small relief when someone helped. The instinct to contain his frustration rather than weaponize it. I remembered those things. Which is why, 3 days later, when everything on Orvanthis Deep shattered and Rael Morrow's name became the center of a crisis that the Galactic Compact would be unraveling for decades, I knew exactly who I was looking for. It started with the Drokai. Orvanthis Deep, as I said, was technically neutral ground. But neutrality is a fiction that everyone agrees to maintain until it stops being convenient. The Drokai sovereignty had been watching the station's positioning for years. It sat close enough to their buffer zone to be strategically interesting, and Drokai strategic interest had a way of becoming Drokai territorial interest given enough time. There were 47 Drokai military personnel aboard the station when it happened. Not unusual, Drokai traveled in large groups always, and they had legitimate cargo interests on Orvanthis Deep. They wore their thermal coats and their rank chains, and they moved through the corridors in formations of 3, which was cultural rather than tactical, though the distinction became blurry quickly. On the 3rd day of my stay, I was in one of the station's lower concourses, a long, broad corridor that functioned as a mixed-species market. Vendors lined both walls. Food, equipment, spare parts, information, everything had a price on Orvanthis Deep if you knew who to ask. I was negotiating a translation fee with a Sephine broker when I heard the sound. Not loud at first. A raised voice, Drokai, the rumbling bass frequency of their speaking register, carrying authority and irritation in equal measure. Then a response, quieter. Then the sound of something being knocked over, a crash of a vendor's table. Then a scattering of smaller feet, the non-confrontational species clearing space fast, which was always the first sign that something was tipping toward real danger. I looked up. In the center of the corridor, 20 meters away, there was a Drokai soldier, young. I could tell by his rank chain, only 2 links standing over a collapsed table. Beside him, 3 more Drokai watching. And on the floor, surrounded by scattered merchandise, small, delicate things, handcrafted objects that had taken significant force to scatter that thoroughly, was a small figure. Elderly, female. Sephine species, which meant fragile by most physical standards. Sephine were slender-boned, their exoskeletal ridges providing more structural support than they appeared to, but under real force they broke easily. She was down on one knee, her environmental filter cracked along the seal, a serious problem for Sephine, who needed filtered air in environments like this. She was trying to stand. The Drokai soldier was not helping her stand. He was standing very still, in a posture that communicated to everyone watching that this had not been an accident. The corridor had gone very quiet. The Valorian vendors nearest to the incident had stepped back. I could see their scales moving in the rapid, involuntary ripple pattern that meant fear. The other Drokai weren't intervening. Drokai internal code didn't permit interference with another member's demonstration of dominance, even if the target was elderly and clearly no threat. The Sephine broker beside me said, very quietly in their own language, "Don't." I wasn't moving, but I understood the warning. There were 4 armed Drokai soldiers and a station where the security response time was notoriously slow. Intervening in a Drokai dominance assertion without standing or authority was not just useless, it was an invitation to become the new target. The old Sephine woman was trying to gather her scattered merchandise with shaking hands. Her cracked filter was leaking. I could see the microvapor trails, and she had maybe 15 minutes before the unfiltered air started causing her real distress. The Drokai soldier said something. I caught enough of it to understand. He was telling her that her merchandise was now his, that she had been on his path, that this was the natural order of things. The corridor watched. Nobody moved. And then someone came around the corner from the upper access stairwell. Rael Morrow. He was off duty, I think. He wasn't carrying his pack. He had his military jacket, but it was open at the collar, which I'd come to understand was how Terran military personnel indicated non-operational status. He was carrying a small container of something, food from one of the upper concourse vendors, probably. Just walking. Just a young human on a station he was still learning to navigate, carrying his dinner back to wherever his temporary billet was. He came around that corner and he stopped. He took in the scene in maybe 2 seconds. The elderly Sephine woman on the floor, the cracked filter, the scattered merchandise, the 4 Drokai, the watching crowd, the silence that had the particular texture of a moment no one was willing to interrupt. He looked at the Drokai soldier, who was standing over the old woman. Then he set down his food container carefully, on the edge of the corridor wall, out of the way, and he walked forward. Not fast, not aggressive, just directly. With the unhurried certainty of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. He reached the old Sephine woman. He crouched down beside her. He started gathering her merchandise and placing it back on the overturned table, methodically, carefully, without looking at the Drokai soldier directly. The soldier said something sharp. "I caught it. Move away from there. This is not your concern." Morrow picked up a small carved object. I could see it was delicate, decorative, probably valuable, and placed it gently on the table. He said something back in compact standard. His voice was level. I was too far away to catch all of it, but I caught the tone. Calm, neither deferential nor confrontational. Like he was explaining something reasonable to someone who might not have considered it. The Drokai soldier's rank chains clinked as he shifted his weight. A physical signal I recognized, the pre-confrontation adjustment, making space for the limbs to move freely. The other 3 Drokai straightened. The corridor held its breath. Morrow finished writing the table. Then he took off his military jacket, his open, off-duty jacket, and he placed it around the old Sephine woman's shoulders, over her cracked filter, creating a basic seal. Not perfect, but enough to slow the leak. She looked up at him with an expression I couldn't read from a distance, but I could see her hands had stopped shaking. Then Morrow stood up. He faced the Drokai soldier. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at him, and the Drokai soldier, who was a full head taller and significantly broader, looked back. What happened in that moment of eye contact? I've tried to describe it to people since, and I never quite get it right. It wasn't defiance exactly. It wasn't bravado. It was something more specific and harder to name. It was the look of a person who has calculated the situation clearly, knows exactly what it might cost, and has decided the cost is acceptable. The Drokai soldier took a step forward. Morrow didn't step back. What I want to tell you is that there was a fight, and Morrow won. That's not what happened. What happened was stranger and, honestly, more significant. The Drokai soldier raised his arm, the dominant arm, the one with the rank signet on his wrist, and pointed directly at Morrow's chest. A Drokai challenge declaration. In their social code, that gesture in that context was an unambiguous statement. You have interfered with my exercise of status. I am claiming resolution. In plain terms, I am going to hurt you. The corridor had gone past quiet into something else, that particular stillness where people have stopped breathing. I could see vendors who had tried to step back now frozen against the walls with nowhere else to go. Morrow looked at the pointed arm, looked at the soldier's face. Then he did something that nobody in that corridor expected. He reached into his jacket that was now on the old woman's shoulders, which meant he was reaching into thin air by instinct, remembered he'd given it away, and then very calmly reached into his shirt pocket instead and pulled out a small, flat device. His standard-issue communication unit, military model, the kind with a direct encrypted channel to his unit's emergency relay. He held it up so the Drokai soldier could see it clearly. He said, in compact standard, loudly enough for the corridor to hear, "I am Corporal Rael Morrow of the Terran Cooperative Defense Force, currently on assignment under the Joint Observer Military Exchange Protocol. What is happening here is being recorded and transmitted to my command relay. I want you to know that. I'm not saying it as a threat. I'm saying it because you deserve to make an informed decision." A pause. The corridor was so quiet I could hear the environmental system cycling. "And my decision," Morrow continued in the same level voice, "is that I'm going to stay here beside this person until she's safe to move. That's all I'm doing. That's all I'm going to do. I'm not challenging you. I'm not interfering with your authority or your sovereignty. I'm staying beside someone who needs a moment to recover. If you want to make that a conflict, I can't stop you, but it will be recorded and transmitted, and your commanding officers will know exactly what the record shows." The Drokai soldier's arm lowered, slowly. Not because he was afraid of Morrow. One young human military corporal was not, in 2089, a physical threat to a Drokai soldier who had years of combat training behind him. He lowered his arm because of the communication unit. Because what Morrow had just done, calmly, without flinching, standing over an elderly stranger, was tell every recording system on that device. And through that device, every relay station it could reach. And through those relay stations, every archive that received its transmission, exactly what had happened in that corridor. The Drokai soldier understood what that meant better than Morrow probably did at the time. A record. A clear, unambiguous, encrypted, verified record of a Drokai military personnel in a non-combat situation exerting physical force against a civilian of another species. In a corridor full of witnesses, with observer status military personnel from a new species standing there, holding the device, saying, "I am not threatening you, I am informing you." The soldier looked at his three companions. The three companions looked at each other. The entire calculus of the situation had shifted in about 8 seconds. The soldier said something I didn't catch. Then he turned and walked away. His three companions followed. They disappeared around the far corner of the corridor. The corridor exhaled. People started moving again, slowly at first, then with the slightly manic energy of a crowd that has been holding tension and is now releasing it. The Valorian vendor's scales were still rippling. The Sephine broker beside me made a sound that I think was relief. Someone, somewhere down the corridor, started talking too loudly about nothing in particular. I made my way through the crowd to where Morrow was crouching again beside the old woman, checking her improvised filter seal. "Does she need medical?" I asked. "I think so," he said. "The filter's cracked along the pressure seal. She needs the full thing replaced, not just patched. Do you know where the station medical bay is?" "Yes." "Can you ask her if she can walk or if she needs help? I don't have enough Sephine to ask properly." I crouched beside the woman and spoke to her in Sephine. She answered in a voice that was thin but steady. She could walk, she said, but slowly. She had been coming to this market for 16 years. She was a regular vendor, and she had never been treated that way before. She wanted to know who the young creature in the military clothes was, because she intended to remember his name. I told her his name was Rael Morrow. She repeated it carefully. Then she asked me to tell him that she had children, and that her children had children, and that she wanted all of them to know his name too. I told Morrow what she'd said. He looked briefly uncomfortable, the particular discomfort of someone who did something because it was right and genuinely doesn't know how to receive gratitude for it. "I just stayed next to her," he said. "That wasn't." "It was enough," I said. In that moment, it was exactly enough. We got the old woman. Her name was Sephine. She corrected me twice when I tried to abbreviate it to the medical bay. The attendant replaced her filter in about 20 minutes. She sat through the procedure holding Morrow's jacket in her lap, neatly folded, which she returned to him when it was done with a formality that suggested she considered it a significant gesture. Morrow took it back with matching formality. He'd figured out that much about Sephine culture instinctively, I noted. We walked out into the corridor together, the three of us briefly, before Sephine went one way with her cart and her repaired filter, and Morrow and I stood there in the mid-rotation foot traffic of Orvanthis Deep. "That was a stupid thing to do," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "If he hadn't backed down, it would have gone badly." "Right." He looked at his communication unit. "I wasn't even sure the recording was transmitting. The relay connection on the station is." He made a gesture I interpreted as unreliable. I was mostly hoping he didn't know that. I looked at him for a moment. "You bluffed." "I mean, the device was recording. Whether it was transmitting is a different question." I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Something about the specificity of that, the precision of his improvised honesty, was deeply funny in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Morrow smiled. A real one this time, not the controlled professional expression I'd seen before. Please don't put that in any official report. I have no official reports to file, I said. I'm a cargo interpreter. Good, he paused. Thank you for translating, for helping her, and he searched for the word, for being the first person on that station who moved toward the problem instead of away from it. I was quiet for a moment. You moved toward it first, I said. He put his jacket back on. Someone had to. What happened next happened fast, and then slow, and then in ways that nobody, not Morrow, not me, not the Compact, certainly not the Drokai, fully understood until years later. The recording did transmit. Not completely and not immediately. The relay connection on Orvanthis Deep was, as Morrow had suspected, unreliable, but it transmitted enough. A partial record, fragmented but coherent, showing a Drokai military personnel engaging in an unprovoked act of dominance assertion against a Sephine civilian in a registered neutral zone, and an observer status military officer from Earth intervening non-violently, on record, and diffusing the situation without escalation. That record reached the Compact Military Oversight Bureau within 48 hours. The Drokai command structure received a formal inquiry within 72. By the end of the week, the 4 Drokai soldiers had been quietly rotated off Orvanthis Deep and returned to their base posting. No formal censure. The Compact wasn't willing to push that hard, but the inquiry itself was a message. The Drokai understood messages. Sephine filed a civilian incident report with the Compact Commerce Division. She listed Corporal Rael Morrow by name as the intervening party, and she used words in Sephine that translated, roughly, as conducted himself with the dignity of someone twice his standing. In Sephine's social architecture, that was approximately the highest compliment available. That report went into the Compact's General Registry, where it sat for 3 months. And then a Compact administrative archivist doing a routine cross-reference noticed something. The name Rael Morrow appeared in 2 separate registries, the Military Exchange Program records and the Civilian Incident Report. Routine enough. But the cross-reference also flagged the species designation, Terran, human. It flagged it because, in the previous 30 years of human contact with the Compact, there had been 0 instances of observer status personnel filing any incident report from either side. 0 complaints, 0 commendations, 0 records of any kind involving direct interaction with Compact civilians in conflict situations. This was the first. The archivist, whose name I later learned was a Sephine named Orvanthis, did what a good archivist does when they find something unusual. She read the full record carefully. She cross-referenced the Drokai inquiry. She looked at the timeline. And then she wrote a memo. I have a copy of that memo now. It's not long, 7 paragraphs, but the last paragraph I'll tell you what it said in translation because I think it matters. The conduct of Terran military personnel Corporal Morrow during the Orvanthis incident demonstrates something that does not appear in our existing assessments of human behavior. The capacity for principled intervention on behalf of parties with whom they share no political, species, or territorial affiliation, at personal risk, with no apparent strategic calculation. This is either a cultural outlier or an indication that our assessment frameworks for this species require significant revision. I recommend the latter. That memo went to the Compact Assessment Board. The board, which had 43 other things to worry about that quarter, filed it. But it had been read, and it had been noted. And the Compact Assessment Frameworks for Human Capabilities began, very quietly, to be re-examined. Morrow finished his posting on Orvanthis Deep. His liaison meeting with the Compact military representative went well, apparently better than expected, partly because word of the corridor incident had circulated through the station's administrative tier by the time the meeting happened, And the Compact liaison, a senior Valorian officer who normally treated observer status personnel with polished indifference, was unexpectedly warm. I heard about this secondhand. I had moved on by then. My cargo work took me in a different direction, toward the Sephine border systems. I didn't see Rael Morrow again for 11 years. But I thought about what happened on Orvanthis Deep, on and off, during those 11 years. The way a specific moment sometimes lodges itself in your memory, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Something about it felt true in a way that most things didn't. The decision he made to set down his dinner and walk toward a problem that had nothing to do with him was such a small thing, such an unremarkable act of basic decency. And yet the universe, which is mostly cold and calculating, sometimes notices those things. Sometimes it keeps score. I didn't know, standing in that corridor on Orvanthis Deep, watching a young human hand a jacket to an old woman, that I was watching the first page of an empire being written. I just knew it felt like something that mattered. And sometimes that's enough to know. 11 years is long enough for a coincidence to become a pattern. 11 years is long enough for a pattern to become policy. And 11 years is long enough for a species that the Galactic Compact dismissed as tolerated newcomers to become something the Compact's oldest members stayed up very late arguing about, in the measured, careful language of people who are frightened but don't want to admit it. In those 11 years, Earth had not waited for the Compact's assessment frameworks to finish revising themselves. Earth had been paying attention to what the universe was. And the universe, it turned out, was very good at teaching lessons to anyone willing to learn them. I saw Rael Morrow again at the Compact convocation on Terran Station. He wasn't a corporal anymore. He was a general commander in the newly restructured Terran Frontier Defense Division, a branch of the human military that, 11 years ago, had not existed, because 11 years ago the Terran military didn't operate at the scale or range that required frontier divisions. A lot had changed. His hair was shorter, and there was a particular stillness about him now that hadn't been there before, the stillness of someone who has been in rooms where decisions get made and has learned to carry that weight without showing it. He was standing at the edge of the convocation hall, holding a glass of something, watching the room with the same quality of attention I remembered, quiet, total, and without judgment. I walked over. He recognized me before I got close. I saw it in the slight shift of his posture, not surprise, just acknowledgement. "You're still traveling," he said. "Cargo interpretation," I said, though now I mostly interpret for treaty delegations rather than trade manifests, fancier words for the same problem. Language is getting clearer or messier. "Considerably messier," I said. "People use more words when they're scared." He smiled at that. Then he looked back at the room. The convocation was in pre-session. The formal part hadn't started yet. Delegates from 43 Compact member species were clustered in their various social configurations around the great circular hall, and the noise level had the specific chaotic quality of 43 different species, all trying to establish social positioning before the official proceedings began. "What brings you here?" I asked. He turned the glass in his hands. "Humanity has a proposal before the convocation." "I know," I said. "Everyone knows. That's why the hall is fuller than I've ever seen it." He nodded slowly. "Are you here for the Sephine delegation?" "Loosely. I was asked to provide independent translation support for the proceedings. The convocation's standard translation systems have known gaps in the Terran legal dialect. Apparently, your people have developed some contract language constructions in the last decade that the standard systems can't parse properly." He raised an eyebrow. "We've been busy." "Yes," I said, "I noticed. I want to tell you what the galaxy looked like 11 years after Orvanthis Deep, because it matters for understanding what came next. The Galactic Compact, when I first started traveling, was a system of managed inequality dressed up as cooperative governance. 43 member species, each with theoretically equal representation, in practice sorted into a rigid hierarchy that everyone acknowledged and nobody officially admitted. The Drokai sovereignty at the top, because they had the largest military and the most territory and the longest history of making other species uncomfortable about those facts. The Valorian commercial consortium below them, because money and military power have a useful relationship. The Sephine collective in the upper middle tier, because their scientific and analytical capabilities were indispensable, and even the Drokai needed things analyzed occasionally. And then, distributed across the lower tiers in various arrangements of managed irrelevance, everyone else. Humans were at the bottom, observer status, tolerated newcomers, interesting as a curiosity, negligible as a political force. That was the galaxy 11 years ago. What it looked like now was different. And the difference had nothing to do with humans becoming militarily powerful or technologically superior or economically dominant. Not yet. What had happened was subtler than that, and in some ways more significant. What had happened was that humans had become reliable. Let me explain what I mean. In the 11 years following Orvanthis Deep, 7 more incidents had been formally recorded involving Terran military or diplomatic personnel in situations where intervention was possible, risky, and strategically unnecessary. 7 situations where a human being in an official capacity had chosen to do the right thing when doing nothing would have been easier, safer, and professionally wiser. A Terran trade delegate in the Sephine border systems who flagged a falsified cargo manifest that, on investigation, turned out to be connected to a Drokai smuggling operation. She gained nothing from reporting it. She made powerful enemies. She reported it anyway. A pair of Terran military observers during a Drokai-Valorian territorial skirmish who, when ordered by both sides to evacuate their observation post, instead transmitted a real-time neutral record of the engagement to the Compact Oversight Bureau, ensuring that the official account couldn't be later manipulated by either party. Their evacuation vessel was damaged in the process. Both observers survived. Their commanding officer later said they had been told to leave and made a judgment call. The Compact Bureau received a complete, unmanipulated record of a skirmish for the first time in its operating history. A Terran medical vessel diverted from its scheduled route to respond to a distress signal from a Sephine colony ship that had suffered catastrophic environmental failure. The diversion cost the vessel 3 weeks of schedule and a significant operational budget. The human crew treated 47 Sephine survivors, including 11 children. They asked for nothing in return. They filed the incident under humanitarian response, unplanned, no compensation sought. And so on. 7 incidents, 7 records, each one in isolation small. Each one taken together, building something that the Compact's assessment frameworks, now extensively revised, had started calling the Terran Reliability Index. The index had no formal status. It was a research document, not a policy document, but it was being read widely. And it was changing the calculation that species across the Compact were making about humanity in ways that no amount of military buildup or economic development could have accomplished as quickly. Because what the index showed, in cold analytic language, was this: in every recorded situation where a Terran representative had faced a choice between principled action and strategic convenience, they had chosen principled action. Not always perfectly, not always successfully, but consistently and at personal cost and without apparent expectation of reward. The Compact had never seen that pattern before. In 400 years of registered species interaction, they had never seen a pattern like that. And they didn't know what to do with it. The new things in the galaxy in those 11 years were human things. medical technology that the Terran scientific delegation had shared openly with 7 species without licensing agreements or trade contingencies. Not because they were required to, but because, when asked why, the lead scientist had said, with evident confusion, because people shouldn't have to die from things we know how to treat. A conflict mediation framework that Terran diplomatic personnel had spent 4 years developing with the Sephine Collective, now in active use in 3 ongoing territorial disputes. The framework worked differently from existing compact mediation protocols, because it was designed around what all parties actually needed rather than what their stated positions were, a distinction that sounded simple, and had taken the Compact's best negotiators decades to stop finding confusing. A network of deep space relay stations that the Terran Cooperative had funded and built across the unregistered drift, the dead corridor where Orvanthis Deep sat, making the region navigable and connected for the first time. The relay stations were available to all compact traffic, with no usage fees and no political conditions. The Drokai Military Command had requested, through back channels, that the network require Drokai authorization codes. The Terran response, delivered politely and in writing so there was a record, was no. And then, 6 months before the convocation, the incident that changed everything. The Velhari. I should explain the Velhari, because most people outside the Compact inner systems don't know them. The Velhari were a species that the Compact had classified 90 years earlier as pre-technological and non-contact eligible. In practice, this meant they lived on their planet Velhara, a world in the outer reach of the Drokai buffer zone, and the Compact left them alone because they weren't useful. No technology to trade, no resources that weren't available elsewhere, no strategic significance. The Drokai had been less committed to the non-contact principle than the Compact's official position suggested. What a Terran survey vessel discovered 6 months before the convocation, when it was conducting a routine deep drift navigation survey of the buffer zone, following the relay network that humans had built through the unregistered drift, was that Velhara had been under systematic resource extraction for at least 30 years. Not violent. The Drokai were too sophisticated for overt violence in the early stages. They had made contact with the Velhari, established what the Velhari understood as a reciprocal relationship, and then gradually redirected the infrastructure of that relationship toward extracting the one resource Velhara had in abundance that the Drokai needed. A rare mineral compound, found in Velhara's deep crust, that was essential for certain categories of Drokai military technology. The Velhari didn't know. They had no concept of what was being taken or its value. They had participated in what they understood as a friendship. The Terran survey vessel sent its report to the Terran Cooperative Command. It took Command 48 hours to respond. Their response was to forward the report, unedited and in its entirety, to the Compact Oversight Bureau, the Compact Ethics Commission, the Sephine Collective Scientific Authority, and every registered Compact member species with diplomatic access to the Drokai sovereignty. At the same time, the survey vessel's commander, a woman named Captain Yeva Strand, contacted the Velhari directly through the survey vessel's xenolinguistics system and began the process of explaining to them what had happened. That process took 3 weeks and destroyed Captain Strand's composure repeatedly, by her own account, because explaining to a species that they have been systematically deceived by an entity they trusted is one of the worst things a person can be asked to do. But she did it. Carefully and honestly, and in terms that the Velhari could understand. When it was finished, the Velhari asked one question. They asked what humanity would do about it. Captain Strand said she didn't know, but she said she would make sure humanity knew what had been asked. She transmitted that question verbatim, in its original Velhari form with full translation, to Terran Cooperative Command. Command forwarded it to the convocation agenda. And that was what the convocation on Tersing Station was about. That was why the hall was full. "You understand what they're going to do," I said to Morrow, standing at the edge of the hall, watching the delegates find their positions as the pre-session noise began to settle. "I have some idea," he said. "The Drokai bloc is going to challenge the legality of the filing. They're going to argue that the survey vessel's data collection was unauthorized in the buffer zone. They're going to argue that the relationship with the Velhari was voluntary and beneficial by Velhari definition at the time. They're going to argue that the Terran Cooperative has manufactured this situation to gain political leverage." "I know. And some of that will stick," I said, "because the Compact doesn't move fast, and it doesn't move against its most powerful members without extremely clear legal grounds, and the Drokai legal team has had 6 months to build a framework around those arguments." Morrow turned to look at me, and I'm curious what humanity's counter is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We're not countering." I frowned, explained that. "The proposal we're putting before the convocation isn't a complaint filing," he said. "It's not a legal challenge. We're not asking the Compact to rule against the Drokai. We're asking the Compact for something else entirely." "What?" He took a slow breath. "We're asking them to recognize the Velhari as full Compact members, immediately, with all protections, rights, and representation that entails." I stared at him. "They're pre-technological." "They're pre-technological by the Compact's own arbitrary definition, which was written by species that had an interest in keeping certain categories of people out of the room," Morrow said. Quietly but with a precision that made it clear this wasn't a position he'd arrived at recently. "The Velhari have language, culture, social organization, decision-making processes, and the capacity to understand and consent to representation. The technology threshold is a gatekeeping mechanism, not a measurement of personhood. The Drokai will never agree to that." "No," he said, "they won't. So the vote will fail." "Maybe." He looked back at the room. "But 34 of the 43 member species are not the Drokai, and for the first time in the Compact's history, a significant number of those 34 have been paying attention to what happens when the Compact looks the other way." I was quiet for a moment. "You've been talking to people," I said. "For about 8 months," he said. "Yes." "The Sephine?" "Fully committed." "The Velorian Consortium?" A slight pause. "Mostly. There are commercial relationships with the Drokai that complicate things, but the medical exchange program has been useful for building trust." "The border species, the ones in the lower tiers?" He looked at me steadily. "They've been waiting," he said, "for someone to notice that they exist." The convocation opened formally with the traditional recitation of the Compact Charter, a long, elaborate document that every species present had heard hundreds of times, and that most delegates used as an opportunity to review their notes. I was positioned in the translation bay, a narrow elevated gallery that ran along the inner rim of the hall, with direct feed access to the speaker systems and a clear sight line to every delegation. The Terran delegation was 17 people. Small, by Compact standards, the Drokai had 42 delegates and 3 advisory panels. But the 17 humans were very still and very focused in a way that the larger delegations weren't, and they occupied their section of the great circular floor with a presence that seemed, to me, disproportionate to their number. Morrow wasn't in the delegation. He was in the gallery above civilian observer access, which was technically his correct category since this was a diplomatic proceeding and he was military. He watched from above. I could see him from my position. The filing was presented by the Terran chief delegate, a woman named Ambassador Sora Delant. She was calm and unhurried, and she laid out the Velhari situation in 12 minutes, concise, factual with zero rhetorical inflation. Just the record. Just what the survey vessel had found, what the Drokai extraction had involved, what the Velhari had understood of it, and what they had asked. Then she presented the proposal. The hall went very quiet when she finished. Then the Drokai block's lead delegate rose. He was a senior Drokai. I could count his rank chains without effort, and there were many, and he was very good at his job. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was methodical and precise, and he covered every argument I had anticipated and several I hadn't. He questioned the survey vessel's authorization. He questioned the translation accuracy of the Velhari communications. He questioned the Compact's jurisdiction in the buffer zone. He questioned the human motivation for bringing this filing at this time, and he did so in a way that was technically a question and functionally an accusation. He was very good. And when he finished, there was a shift in the room, a settling of uncertainty, a murmur that ran through the lower-tier delegations in particular, that told me the arguments had landed, not convincingly, but enough to create doubt. And in a body that made decisions by supermajority vote, doubt was a weapon. Ambassador Delant rose again. She said, "Thank you for those points. I want to address them, but I want to start by asking one question, which I'd like the hall to consider before I respond to anything else." She paused. The hall was absolutely still. Approximately 90 standard years ago, she said, the Velhari asked the entity they trusted if the relationship was good for both of them. The answer they received was yes. We know now that answer was false. My question is, who in this room was in a position to tell them the truth, and who chose not to? The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then it lasted longer. What happened in the next 6 hours was not a debate, it was a dismantling. Not of the Drokai's legal arguments. Those were technically sound enough to require careful work. What was dismantled, methodically and without drama, was the assumption that had held the Compact's hierarchy together for 400 years. The assumption that the species at the top of the structure had earned their position through superior judgment, and that the species at the bottom should defer to that judgment. The Sephine delegation presented a 40-year analysis of Compact resource allocation. I had to translate it in real time, and even I, who had been expecting something significant, was not fully prepared for what the data showed. Of the 43 Compact member species, the 31 in the lower 2 tiers had, over 4 decades, contributed 68% of the Compact's scientific research output, 53% of its medical advances, and 41% of its diplomatic resolutions, while receiving 17% of its formal governance influence. The Sephine delegate who presented it said, in a voice that I would describe as clinically precise and quietly devastating, "We are not presenting this as an argument for any particular outcome. We are presenting it because decisions should be made on the basis of accurate information, and we believe this information has not been accurately represented in Compact governance discussions. We leave the conclusion to the hall." The hall drew its own conclusion. You could feel it. Then came what I hadn't anticipated, the border species. One by one, 12 of the lower-tier delegations rose to speak. Not in coordination, I watched the floor and they weren't signaling each other, weren't following a prepared sequence. They rose independently when it felt right to them and said different things. But they said them to the same point. A Farathi delegate said that her species had been asking for decades to have their territorial boundary classification reviewed, and had been told annually that it was under consideration. A Mervyn delegate said that his species' application for upper-tier representation had been pending for 19 years. A Seth collective spoke, rarely. Seth rarely addressed the full convocation, and said that they had documented 47 instances of Compact resource protocols being applied to their territory in ways that their delegation had formally disputed. All 47 disputes were still unresolved. On and on, 12 species, 12 records. None of them new information, all of it documented, filed, archived, technically available to any compact member who looked for it. None of it had ever been said aloud in a full convocation session before. I watched from the translation gallery. I watched Morrow in the observer gallery above. He was very still. He was watching the floor. His face was unreadable, but there was something in the set of his jaw that I recognized from 11 years ago, the expression of a person who has made a decision and is watching it unfold. The Drokai block called for a procedural halt. They said the session had moved outside its registered agenda. Ambassador Delant rose and said that the session's registered agenda included, under Item 7, open representation access, a standing agenda item that had not been invoked in 40 years, but had never been removed from the charter. The Hall's legal counsel, a Valorian impeccably neutral, confirmed this was correct. The Drokai block sat down, and then the vote was called. Not the original proposal. Something had shifted during those 6 hours, and the proposal on the floor was no longer just Velhari membership. There had been procedural amendments, each one carrying its own supporting count, each one building on the last. The final vote was on a restructured proposal. Velhari immediate provisional membership, a mandatory review of all pending lower-tier representation applications within 1 standard year, an independent audit of compact resource allocation over the preceding 4 decades, and the establishment of a new compact ethics oversight body with authority independent of the existing governance tiers. 31 member species voted yes. 9 abstained. 3 voted no. The Drokai were among the 3. For the first time in 400 years, the Galactic Compact passed a governance restructuring resolution over the explicit objection of its dominant power bloc. The hall went not noisy. That surprised me. I expected celebration from the smaller delegations. What I got was something quieter, a kind of stunned, careful relief. The relief of people who have been pressing against a wall for a long time and have felt it finally give way and aren't quite sure yet what's on the other side. I made my way down from the translation gallery when the session formally closed. Morrow was already in the main hall, surrounded by not a crowd exactly, but people, the Sephine chief delegate, the Farathi ambassador, the young Seth observer who had waited for an hour for the right moment, and was now talking to him in rapid Seth that he was obviously not following, but was giving complete attention to regardless. I watched him for a while from across the room. He was doing the same thing he had done 11 years ago in a corridor on Orvanthis Deep. He was giving the person in front of him his full attention, as though that person was the most important thing in the room. In a hall full of historic events and political calculations and the beginning of a restructured galactic order, he was listening to a Seth observer tell him something. I could see from the observer's body language it was personal, emotional, important to them, and he was just listening. Eventually, I made my way over. The Seth observer finished. Morrow said something back, quietly. The observer did something with their exterior membranes that, in Seth body language, indicated profound gratitude. Then they moved away. What did they say? I asked. Morrow was quiet for a moment. They said that the Seth had a phrase in their old language for the moment when something that has been wrong for a very long time begins to become right. They said there isn't a compact standard equivalent. They wanted to tell me what it was, because they felt today was that. What is it? He told me the Seth phrase. I won't try to transliterate it here. Seth vocalizations don't map well to written language, but what it meant, roughly, was the first morning of a thing that should always have been. I looked around the hall. The Valorian delegates were talking among themselves in the rapid, overlapping way they used when they were recalibrating. The Drokai block was conferring quietly in a tight cluster, not angry, which surprised me, or not purely angry, something more complicated. Some of them, I noticed, looked less like people who had lost and more like people who had been relieved of a weight they hadn't known how to put down. Maybe I was reading too much into it. You know, this doesn't fix everything, I said to Morrow. The restructuring is a beginning. The audit is going to be contentious. The Drokai aren't going to simply accept a diminished position. There will be years of... I know, he said. And the Velhari are going to need significant support to integrate into the compact system. Their representative processes are completely different from anything the Charter currently accommodates. We've been developing a transitional framework, he said. We started it 8 months ago when we first got the survey vessel's report. There's a team on it. I stopped. You planned for the vote to succeed, I said. I hoped for it, he said, and I prepared for what came after. What made you think it would work? The Drokai have blocked everything like this for decades. He looked around the hall. Because it wasn't about the Drokai, he said. It was never about the Drokai. It was about everyone else in this room deciding whether they believed the compact was worth what they'd been told it was worth. And I think, for a long time, a lot of species in this hall have suspected the answer was no, but they didn't have the language for it, or the support, or the record to point to. And you gave them the record, I said. We started building it 11 years ago, he said. Not deliberately, not as a strategy, just by trying to do things right when it would have been easier not to. I thought about Sephine then. The old Sephine woman with the cracked filter, in the corridor on Orvanthis Deep, gathering her scattered merchandise with shaking hands. The archivist Ori Vesthal, writing a 7-paragraph memo about a pattern she'd noticed. The 12 border species delegates who had risen today, independently, to say what they had been carrying for years. The relay network through the unregistered drift, the medical exchange, the falsified cargo manifest flagged by a trade delegate who gained nothing from reporting it, the real-time record transmitted by 2 military observers in a damaged vessel, the 47 survivors on a Sephine colony ship. One human, one corridor, one decision to set down his dinner and walk toward a problem. And then a decade of a species deciding, collectively, that the decision that one young corporal had made was the right kind of decision, and that making it over and over again, quietly and consistently, was both who they wanted to be and what the universe needed them to be. The Compact had called it the Terran Reliability Index. The Drokai's analysts in the reports that leaked later called it strategic altruism. They were still trying to find the calculation behind it, the long game, the hidden advantage that made it make sense. They didn't find it. Because it wasn't there. It was just what it looked like. The restructuring took 4 years to fully implement. The Velhari provisional membership was confirmed within 6 months. Their initial representative was a woman named Theva. She had no second name in the Velhari system, which required a minor compact charter amendment to accommodate. She was in her middle years, quietly observant, and she had the particular quality of someone who understood exactly how much she didn't yet know, and had decided that was not a problem but a beginning. I met her at her first compact session. I was there as part of the expanded translation support team that had been established to handle the increased linguistic complexity of a compact that now needed to communicate accurately across 44 species instead of 43. She asked me, through translation, whether I thought the compact was a good place. I told her that it was trying to become one. She said that was enough. The audit took 3 years and was more contentious than expected, which had been expected. The final report was 7,000 pages. It was discussed, disputed, redacted and restored, challenged in 3 separate legal proceedings, and ultimately issued in a form that satisfied nobody completely and acknowledged most things honestly. The Drokai sovereignty accepted the findings under formal protest, which meant accepting them. The redistribution of resource allocations that followed changed the economic calculus for 12 species permanently. The Drokai adjusted. They did so gradually and sometimes poorly, and with periodic outbursts of diplomatic intransigence that required considerable patience. But they adjusted. Because the alternative, an exit from a compact that now had 31 solid votes moving in a coherent direction, was not actually an option for a species whose stability depended on trade relationships with those 31 species. Power, it turned out, was more flexible than it pretended to be when the mathematics changed. The Terran Cooperative was formally elevated from observer status to full compact membership in the third year of the restructuring period. The vote was 39 in favor, 3 abstentions, 1 no. The ceremony was held on Tercine Station, in the same hall as the convocation. Ambassador Delant accepted the membership charter on behalf of the Terran Cooperative. She said something in English that I had to translate for the hall. "We're glad to finally be at the table. We'll try to be worth the seat." The new compact ethics oversight body was chaired, in its first term, by Orvanthis, the archivist who had written the 7-paragraph memo about Corporal Rael Morrow 11 years earlier. She was, by general assessment, exactly as good at the job as anyone who had paid attention could have predicted. Precise, unhurried, and constitutionally unwilling to allow accurate information to be substituted with convenient information. She sent me a message after the ceremony. It said, "I reread the original memo recently. I still think the last paragraph was right. I just didn't know yet how right." I saw Rael Morrow one more time, several years after the convocation. He was retired from active duty by then. The Terran Cooperative had offered him any number of things: ambassadorships, advisory positions, a seat on the new compact committee that was developing the protocol for first contact with newly discovered species. He declined most of them. He was living on a small station in the outer drift, not far, actually, from Orvanthis Deep, working as a consultant for something called the Compact Integration Support Bureau, which was a dry, bureaucratic name for the team that helped newly recognized species navigate the overwhelming machinery of compact membership. He was helping the Velhari mostly. Theva had asked for him specifically through official channels. She said, and I was told this by the liaison who forwarded the request, that she wanted someone who understood the experience of being new to the room and feeling uncertain about whether you belonged there. He had agreed immediately. I stopped at the station on a courier run. We had dinner, or the equivalent, in a small station cafe that served approximately 4 different species' dietary requirements and did all of them adequately. The station was quieter than Orvanthis Deep had been. Cleaner. The relay network had made this part of the drift a proper route now, with regular traffic and registered services, and the kind of slow, accumulating infrastructure that suggested people intended to stay. "Are you happy?" I asked him, which was a strange question maybe given everything. But it felt like the right one. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it the way he did everything, actually considering it rather than reflexively answering. "I don't know if happy is the right word," he said. "I feel like things are more right than they were. That's not the same as happy, but it's," he searched for it, "it's substantial, it's real. It doesn't go away when you're not looking at it." I understood what he meant. "Do you think about that day on Orvanthis?" I asked. "The corridor." He smiled, not the controlled professional smile, the real one. "I think about Sephine," he said. "I think about her saying she wanted her children and her children's children to know my name." He paused. "I thought that was just kindness at the time. I thought it was an old woman being generous. I didn't understand that she was also being literal." "She filed a report," I said. "It went into the archive. It was the first document in the Compact's registry that created the pattern. The archivist who caught it just got elected chair of the ethics oversight body." He was quiet for a while. He stopped. Yes, I said. He looked out the port window at the stars of the outer drift. The relay network was visible if you knew where to look, not the stations themselves, but the running lights, a sparse constellation of warm points strung through the cold dark. I just stayed next to her, he said. I know, I said, that was enough. That's the story people don't tell when they talk about the Terran Empire. They talk about the vote counts, the audit findings, the restructured charter, the 44 species compact with its new balances of power. They don't talk about an old woman's filter, cracking in a corridor on a station that nobody remembers. They don't talk about a young soldier setting down his dinner. But I was there. And I know this. The largest things in the universe don't begin in council halls or aboard warships or in the record books of great institutions. They begin with someone deciding, in a moment that costs them something, in a moment when doing nothing would have been so much easier, that the person in front of them is worth staying for. One human. One moment. And then a species that had been watching and learning, and deciding what they wanted to be, chose to be that, over and over again, until the universe had no choice but to notice. That's how you repay a debt without ever calling it one. That's how you build an empire without ever meaning to.